Hey guys, tonight we begin not with a battle or a banquet, but with the very personal, very pungent world of medieval hygiene. We're stepping into a time when people feared bathing more than plague, when garlic could double as perfume, and when your neighbour might literally throw strange things out the window and call it normal. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Cleanliness is next to godliness, said absolutely no one in the 14th century. Let's begin with a surprising fact. In the early Middle Ages, bathing was actually considered a good thing. Monasteries had bathhouses. Roman traditions of soaking and scrubbing still lingered in some corners of Europe. But over time, particularly by the late medieval period, the idea of bathing shifted from healthy to hazardous. So what changed? In short, fear, superstition, and a wildly incorrect understanding of how the human body worked. People believed that hot water opened the pores, which they thought allowed illness to seep in. Imagine bathing during a plague outbreak and thinking, I've just turned myself into a sponge for death. That was the mindset. Bathing too often, they feared, could weaken your body and even invite disease. Water, in this worldview, wasn't cleansing. It was treacherous. It didn't help that bathhouses became morally suspicious. By the 13th and 14th centuries, many public bathhouses, once places of hygiene and even community, became social hubs with a rather scandalous reputation. Some operated like spas, others like brothels. Eventually, church leaders began to associate bathing with sin, which, in medieval Europe, was an excellent way to get things shut down. So instead of scrubbing down, many medieval folks just stopped bathing altogether. Not because they loved being dirty, but because staying dry was seen as safer, holier, and frankly, more modest. After all, being naked was one thing. Being naked in hot water, that was practically inviting the devil in for a splash. This doesn't mean everyone wandered around like a mud-covered goblin. People still cleaned themselves in bits and pieces, washing hands, faces, and feet with cloths and herbal rinses. But the full-body soak became rare, reserved for the very wealthy, the dangerously brave, or the terminally itchy. So yes, medieval people feared bathing. But not because they were lazy or ignorant. They were trying, in their own 14th century way, to stay healthy. Unfortunately, without germ theory, indoor plumbing, or a basic grasp of microbiology, the strategy was more paranoia than prevention. Once upon a time, in a town that didn't yet smell like horse manure and regret, the public bathhouse was a hub of hygiene, health, and mildly inappropriate social interaction. Inspired by lingering Roman influence, early medieval bathhouses offered warm water, communal tubs, and a hint of optimism. These were places where townsfolk could soak, steam, and chat, like a medieval spa day, minus the cucumbers and scented candles. Monks, merchants, and even lower nobles used them. Cleanliness, for a brief moment in time, was both possible and fashionable. Then things got steamy, in the worst way. By the 13th century, bathhouses had acquired a reputation for, let's say, multitasking. Bathing became less about cleanliness and more about companionship. Some bathhouses began offering extra services, with attendants who were suspiciously friendly, and water that had seen far too many strangers. The line between wellness and wantonness blurred fast. It didn't take long for the church to get involved. Public nudity, even when paired with a loofah, was frowned upon. Sexual misconduct? Even worse. Bathhouses became synonymous with sin, disease, and scandal. And once the Black Death rolled into town, people were more than happy to shut them down permanently. After all, you can't spread plague through a public tub if the tub's been boarded shut and declared morally compromised. But it wasn't just sin and sickness that doomed the bathhouse. It was suspicion. Over time, bathing itself began to seem indulgent, even dangerous. The very idea of soaking your body in warm water, especially with strangers, felt like a gateway to both physical and spiritual ruin. And so, one by one, the bathhouses closed. Some were turned into bakeries. Others were simply abandoned and left to rot. A poetic fate, really, for buildings meant to keep people clean. Meanwhile, in monasteries, monks quietly lamented the loss. Many had maintained hygienic practices for centuries, including scheduled bathing. But now even that was in question. The church wasn't banning hygiene outright, just making it incredibly difficult to achieve. Thus began the golden age of dry cleaning, medieval style. Soap became optional, water became suspicious, and the bathhouse? Just another relic of a time when scrubbing didn't come with consequences. Despite the church's growing horror at naked elbows and the widespread belief that a hot bath could let the plague in through your pores, medieval people didn't completely abandon the idea of bathing. They just turned it into something you'd do once a season, or when the smell became sentient. Let's begin with the nobles. Yes, wealthy people bathed, though not so often that their rubber ducks got wrinkly. They had servants lug in cauldrons of boiling water, because indoor plumbing was still centuries away, pour it into a large wooden tub lined with a linen sheet, and sprinkle it with herbs like lavender, sage, or whatever was growing nearby that didn't smell like feet. This wasn't so much a bath as it was a soup you sat in. The bath was often prepared in the bedroom or near a fireplace, privacy optional depending on your level of power or shamelessness. Some even shared the tub with their spouse because what's more romantic than floating in each other's filth like medieval fondue? The poor bathed too, but usually in rivers, barrels, or anything that held water and didn't bite. It wasn't about hygiene. It was about efficiency. Might as well wash the kid, the shirt, and the goat all at once, was probably said more than once. In winter, bathing took a back seat to survival, so instead of soap and water, people turned to a strategy known as pretend you're clean and just keep walking. A few urban bathhouses survived, particularly in southern Europe where warmer weather and better plumbing kept the dream of cleanliness alive. These were sometimes well run, with steam rooms and herbal treatments. Other times, they doubled as venues for extracurricular activities not approved by the Vatican. Either way, you left refreshed, mildly steamed, and possibly slightly judged. For special occasions, like childbirth or plague recovery, people would get proper baths. Because nothing says welcome to the world, or please don't die, like being dipped in a barrel of tepid rosemary water. When full-body immersion became suspect, thanks to the belief that hot water invited disease like an open bar, the medieval world turned to the next best thing, the humble sponge bath. Except, they didn't really have sponges. At least not the soft, mass-produced kind you can buy at any modern store. Instead, they used linen cloths, soaked in warm water, herbs, or vinegar, and wiped themselves down like they were trying to buff a stain off a very delicate chair. Hygiene, in this context, meant dabbing. If you were lucky, someone else did it for you. If you were noble, someone else did it reluctantly. These partial washes focused on hands, face, armpits, and occasionally the feet, the high-traffic areas, so to speak. Underlayers of clothing, particularly linen shirts and shifts, helped absorb sweat and grime, meaning that changing your shirt regularly was about as close to modern hygiene as you were going to get. Your tunic may have been crusty, but your undershirt? Freshish. Of course, nobody was fooling themselves into thinking this was proper cleaning. But if water was limited, or if you believed a proper bath might invite the Black Death, this was the safe bet. And in a world without deodorant, toothpaste, or showers, a cloth soaked in rosewater or vinegar was the medieval equivalent of a spa day, minus the spa, and really minus the day. For wealthier folks, attendants might heat water, mix in herbs like rosemary or marjoram, and gently wash their master or mistress while pretending not to judge them. Peasants would boil water over a fire, then ladle it out into bowls and do the same. perhaps without the subtle judgment, but definitely with more draft. And if you were a monk, you probably had a better routine than most. Many monastic orders required scheduled washing, even if it was more spiritual than sanitary. Either way, the result was the same: a quick rub-down, a whisper of moisture, and a renewed sense of being just clean enough to not scare the livestock. So no, it wasn't glamorous, but it worked, more or less. At least until you had to ride a horse for 6 hours through mud. If medieval hair had a motto, it would probably be flammable but fragrant. Contrary to popular belief, people didn't walk around with matted bird nests on their heads, at least not intentionally. They did, in fact, wash their hair. Just not frequently, and certainly not with anything resembling shampoo. So, what did they use? A variety of home-brewed concoctions that sounded like the first draft of a spellbook. One popular choice was lye soap, made from wood ash and animal fat, which was great for cutting through grease, and also your scalp if used too often. Pair that with water of dubious quality, and you've got yourself a medieval chemical peel. For those hoping to preserve their follicles a little longer, egg yolks were sometimes used as a gentler cleanser. And yes, that meant sitting in a freezing hut with raw eggs sliding down your neck while trying to convince yourself this was nourishing. Others rinsed with beer, which, if nothing else, made you smell like you'd had a wild night, even if you were just trying to remove lice. Some hair washing recipes included vinegar infusions with rosemary or lavender, which did double duty. They covered up other smells and gave the illusion of care. But let's be clear, no one was lathering up and rinsing twice. This was more of a targeted splash and squeeze operation. Water temperature also mattered. Hot water was believed to weaken the brain. Cold water could give you the plague. Lukewarm was the sweet spot, assuming you had fuel to heat it and didn't mind waiting 3 hours for a bucket of bath water that your sibling hadn't already used. Brushing, on the other hand, was routine. Combs made of bone, wood, or horn were common and often elaborately carved, a rare moment of elegance in an otherwise itchy reality, and people took pride in long, well-kept hair. Noble women in particular might spend hours getting their hair braided, coiled, and veiled, all while hoping a nearby fireplace didn't undo their hard work with one rogue spark. Dental care in medieval Europe was less sparkling smile and more, "I still have most of my teeth. What's your excuse?" Now, to their credit, medieval people didn't entirely ignore oral hygiene. They didn't exactly understand it either, but they made a solid effort using what they had, which was mostly cloth, charcoal, and blind hope. There were no toothbrushes. That innovation was still centuries away. Instead, people used linen rags to rub their teeth clean, ideally soaked in something abrasive like salt, crushed mint, or even burnt rosemary ash. The goal wasn't whitening, it was survival. If your breath didn't knock someone over, you were already winning. Some opted for chewing sticks, thin twigs from trees like hazel or elm, frayed at one end to create a brush-like effect. You'd chew until the fibres separated, then scrub your teeth. Think of it as the original biodegradable toothbrush. Organic, compostable, and weirdly bark-flavoured. To freshen breath, people chewed fennel seeds, cloves, or cardamom, depending on what they could afford or steal from the spice rack. In wealthier circles, you might rinse your mouth with vinegar, wine, or even myrrh water, because nothing says dental sophistication like gargling a fluid also used to embalm pharaohs. And if you're wondering about toothpaste, it did sort of exist. Some recipes included powdered charcoal, crushed eggshells, and oyster shell ash, mixed with honey or oil to form a gritty paste. If your mouth didn't feel cleaner afterward, it at least felt sandblasted. Now, dentists, if you could call them that, were usually barbers on their off days. If a tooth was loose, infected, or just annoying, the solution was simple. Yank it out. No anaesthetic, no questions. Just a wooden chair, a strong grip, and a few words to God. Aftercare included rinsing with wine and hoping your soul left your body before the infection set in. Despite all this, medieval people weren't necessarily toothless. Diets were lower in processed sugar, and many rural folks had better dental health than modern snackers. But when rot did set in, it set in fast, and the only toothpaste strong enough to fix it was divine intervention. Let's be honest, if you time-travelled to a bustling medieval town square, your first reaction wouldn't be awe, it would be gagging, because medieval Europe smelled committed to being unforgettable. There was no sewage system, no deodorant, and very few functioning bathtubs, which meant the average street smelled like a combination of sweat, animals, rotting food, and optimism. If your nose survived a trip through the fish market and past the tanner's shop, congratulations, you'd already done better than most tourists. So how did people deal with this olfactory chaos? They got creative. Enter the pomander, a small hollow ball filled with herbs and spices, worn around the neck or tucked into clothing like a medieval Glade plug-in. These were stuffed with cloves, cinnamon, lavender, or musk, and often dipped in ambergris, whale bath, but fancy, to make them smell pleasant. Think of it as carrying around your own portable air filter, only it didn't purify anything, just politely overpowered the filth. Ladies often wore scented sachets in their bodices, both to mask their own body odour and to ward off the smell of others. Some even braided herbs like rosemary or marjoram directly into their hair. It was equal parts hygiene, fashion, and spiritual pest control. For those with coin, perfume was imported from the Middle East or Italy, made from rose oil or civet, extracted from the rear end of a very surprised cat-like animal. Applying it involved dabbing, waving, and pretending you weren't just covering up the stench of boiled turnips and regret. And then there were the environmental smells, open sewers, livestock, candle smoke, and whatever the local butcher had just flung into the street. Cities were often enveloped in a fog of funk. But no one really complained, because everyone was in the same nasal nightmare together. It was communal suffering, with notes of garlic. The church encouraged spiritual cleanliness, but physical scent was left largely to chance. If you smelled decent, people assumed you were rich or saintly. If you didn't, you were just blending in. If you've ever forgotten to wear deodorant and spent the day nervously checking your armpits like a suspicious criminal, imagine doing that for your entire life. Except no one had deodorant, and everyone smelled like they'd been jousting in wool for 3 days straight. Welcome to the Middle Ages, where body odour wasn't just a possibility. It was an identity. There were no roll-ons, no sprays, and certainly no clinical-strength aluminum-based antiperspirants. People simply sweated, and then made peace with it. Sort of. To mask or manage the musk, people employed various tricks. One common method was alum powder, a naturally occurring mineral salt that has mild, antibacterial and astringent properties. It didn't stop sweat, but it could cut down on the stench, assuming you remembered to apply it and didn't mind grinding rocks into your pits. Others used chalk, vinegar rinses, or crushed herbs. Sage, mint, and rosemary were popular, not because they were effective, but because they smelled like something better than you. The logic was simple. If you can't stop the sweat, at least try to smell like a salad. In fact, perfumed handkerchiefs were all the rage among nobles, mostly so they could hold them under their noses while navigating crowded streets. No one wants to smell like medieval stew meat, but everyone did. The best you could do was smell like floral stew meat. Medieval medicine also played its part, unfortunately. Physicians believed sweating was a healthy way to purge bad humours, so blocking it was seen as suspicious, possibly even dangerous. You were expected to sweat, stink, and let the body cleanse itself. You weren't unclean, you were just medically fragrant. Then there was the fashion problem. Layers upon layers of wool, linen, and fur trapped heat and moisture like a mobile greenhouse. Combine that with open fires, feasting, and the occasional plague, and you had yourself a sensory experience worthy of a full-blown evacuation. But hey, you weren't alone. Everyone around you smelled, even the king, even the priests, even the woman selling you radishes who hasn't bathed since Epiphany. In short, deodorant wasn't real, but shared suffering absolutely was. In a world without showers, soaps that didn't maim, or deodorant that didn't involve herbs stuffed into your armpit, medieval people turned to an unlikely hero in their hygiene routine: linen. Not to eat off of, but to wear, preferably close to the body and changed before it grew legs. Linen undergarments were the unsung saviours of the Middle Ages. Breathable, absorbent, and surprisingly durable, they were worn beneath the heavier, more unwashable layers of wool and fur. Linen shirts, chemises, and shifts soaked up the sweat, grime, and everything else the body enthusiastically produced in a world that celebrated moisture but misunderstood soap. The logic was elegant. Wash the linen, not the person. Because scrubbing your own body was risky, see, the plague, but scrubbing your shirt, perfectly safe. People might go weeks without bathing, but they would change their underlayer, sometimes even twice a week, which, by medieval standards, was practically saintly. Linen was so respected that it became a status signal. If your shirt was white and relatively clean, people assumed you had your life together. If it was grey, crusty, and sprouting mould, well, you were either poor, possessed, or recently resurrected. For women, the linen shift was essential. It protected outer garments from sweat, and perhaps more importantly, from the smell of sweat. It was the medieval version of Febreze, only less chemical and far more judgmental if not maintained. Knights wore linen under their armour to avoid turning into baked ham during tournaments. Monks wore it under their habits. Even peasants wore linen tunics, though usually patched, threadbare, and held together by sheer willpower. Of course, washing linen wasn't fun. It involved boiling water, lye, beating the fabric on rocks, and hoping the river didn't sweep it away. But it was still easier than bathing yourself or dealing with the spiritual consequences of baring your chest to a tub of warm water. If there was one thing truly consistent in the medieval hygiene routine, it was itching. Not because people were allergic to linen or hay, though let's be honest, probably that too, but because they were constantly playing host to an entire travelling circus of lice, fleas, and mites. Lice were such an everyday nuisance that they were basically treated like unwanted roommates. You didn't get lice, you just had lice. Everyone did. Rich, poor, pious, drunk. Lice didn't discriminate. They were the true equalizers of medieval society. So what did people do? Well, for starters, they combed. Lice combs, often made of bone or wood, were common personal items, like a toothbrush is today, except instead of polishing teeth, you were raking bugs off your scalp like some kind of tiny, screaming orchard. These combs had fine, closely packed teeth designed to pull out the critters, their eggs, and most of your patience. Another method? Boiling clothes or baking them near the fire. The heat could kill the lice, assuming you didn't burn your only tunic in the process. This is also why you might see medieval illustrations of people holding up their shirts near a flame. It wasn't laundry day, it was pest execution. And then there was the classic technique of shaving one's head. Particularly among monks or those who could get away with a bald look, removing all hair was an effective, if dramatic, solution. Sometimes a wig was worn on top, which ironically could become its own lice hotel, if not cleaned properly. Still, the logic was clear. No hair, no home for the vermin. Fleas were another problem, especially for those sleeping in straw mattresses or surrounded by animals. There weren't flea collars or bug sprays, only smoke fumigation and herbal sachets tossed between the sheets. Some believed certain smells repelled the pests. Others probably just hoped the fleas moved on to someone smellier. But the real solution was endurance. Everyone itched, everyone scratched. It was part of life, like taxes, death, or stepping in something unspeakable near the market stalls. Ah, the medieval toilet, a term that feels wildly optimistic. Because in truth, going to the bathroom in the Middle Ages was less about comfort and more about creative improvisation and lowered expectations. Let's start with the elite. Castles had garderobes, which were basically closets with a hole in a stone bench that dropped straight down, sometimes into a moat, sometimes into a pit, and occasionally into an unfortunate patch of earth someone forgot to fence off. These were often located high up in towers for privacy and the added thrill of gravity. If you were below one, you learned quickly not to loiter. Peasants, on the other hand, had fewer luxuries. Most did their business outside, in the woods, near the river, or behind the barn. Some villages had communal pits, essentially outhouses with very low standards and even lower privacy. Your neighbour might be in there, discussing crop yields mid-squat. For nighttime needs, chamber pots were the star of the show. These portable pots were tucked under beds or beside sleeping areas, ready to receive contributions in the dead of night. If you've never had the pleasure of relieving yourself into a cold ceramic bowl next to your sleeping family in the pitch dark, congratulations, you're not medieval. And what did they do with the contents of said pots? They threw them out the window. Literally. With a hearty shout of, "Gardez l'eau!" Watch out for the water. Residents would dump their waste into the street below, ideally not hitting any passers-by. But let's face it, accuracy wasn't guaranteed. Street sanitation was handled mostly by gravity and pigs. Cities sometimes had gutters or central ditches to carry waste away, though these often clogged, overflowed, or just sat there fermenting into a neighbourhood feature. Toilet paper? Not quite. People used rags, moss, straw, their hands, or, for the very refined, bits of wool or linen scraps. If that sounds unpleasant, imagine using snow in the winter. Because they did. Before everyone collectively decided that bathing was suspicious and probably a sin, public bathhouses were actually thriving in medieval Europe. These weren't just tubs and soap, they were the social hotspots of their day. Think of them as medieval spas, with a few extra plot twists. Bathhouses offered a variety of services: hot baths, steam rooms, massage, food, music, and, depending on the establishment, the occasional questionable companionship. At their best, they were communal wellness centres. At their worst, they were bare-skinned dens of gossip, gluttony, and light scandal. And sometimes all three before noon. They were called stews, not because you sat in one too long, although you might, but because of the steamy water. Mixed gender bathing wasn't unheard of, especially in places like Germany or Italy, where attitudes were a bit more relaxed. It wasn't always risque. Families could attend together, monks sometimes bathed in pairs, but human nature being what it is, boundaries got murky. So did the water. Naturally, this made bathhouses a favourite target for the church. Clerics warned that bathing in mixed company led to sin, which, to be fair, it often did. Some bathhouses subtly became brothels with plumbing. The waters got hot, and not just from the fire beneath the tub. Then came the plagues, and everything changed. When diseases like the Black Death struck, bathhouses were blamed. Doctors believed open pores invited disease, and since warm baths opened pores, well, the math added up in a we don't know about germs sort of way. Bathhouses shut down, reputations tanked, and suddenly the public bath was out. Permanently. Some regions held onto the tradition a bit longer. Southern Europe, the Middle East, and certain port cities kept their stews boiling for decades more. But in Northern and Central Europe, bathhouses began to vanish faster than your dignity after slipping into a communal tub. What remained was a mix of nostalgia and paranoia. Bathhouses had been warm, lively places, but they'd also become symbols of sin, disease, and damp decision-making. By the 1500s, the average person wasn't soaking with strangers anymore. They were dabbing at their armpits with vinegar and praying for the invention of soap that didn't smell like goat. Soap in the Middle Ages was a lot like medicine at the time, harsh, experimental, and likely to make you question your life choices. It technically worked, but using it felt more like punishment than self-care. The most common recipe? A hearty blend of animal fat and lye, or, if you want to sound fancy, rendered tallow and wood ash. When combined, these ingredients created a substance that could strip dirt, oil, and possibly your soul from any surface. Early soap didn't come in pleasant pastel bars with ocean breeze scents. It came in coarse, waxy lumps that looked like something you'd avoid stepping in. To make it, you needed patience and a strong stomach. Boil down sheep or pig fat, stir in alkaline ash water, and wait while it hardened into blocks. If you added herbs like lavender, rosemary, or mint, you could convince yourself it was artisanal. But mostly, it just smelled like damp campfire and disappointment. Soap was mainly used for laundry and heavy-duty scrubbing, not so much for the body, at least not casually. Skin was considered delicate, and lye soap could turn a bath into a mild chemical burn. Still, people used it when necessary, especially before special events like weddings, court appearances, or plague outbreaks. More refined soaps came from the Islamic world and southern Europe, particularly Castile soap from Spain, made with olive oil instead of animal fat, and far gentler on the skin. These soaps were coveted luxury goods, traded across the Mediterranean, and reserved for people who didn't already smell like goat on a daily basis. But for most folks, soap was a utility, not a pleasure. You used it to wash your linens, your dishes, maybe your hands, and only if they were really offensive. It wasn't part of a daily hygiene ritual. It was a monthly event, like taxes or a full moon. Some people went their whole lives with minimal soap exposure and considered themselves just fine, especially when surrounded by others doing exactly the same. Communal odour has a way of setting the bar low. In medieval Europe, doing the laundry wasn't just a chore, it was a full-body workout, a community event, and a flirtation with frostbite. Forget laundromats or washing machines. If you wanted clean clothes, you had to be willing to boil, beat, and beg the weather to cooperate. Most laundry was done in rivers, which sounds picturesque until you remember that these rivers also served as sewers, livestock baths, and the occasional body disposal site. But hey, running water is running water. First you soaked your linens in lye or urine. Yes, actual human urine, collected in pots and stored until it reached peak potency. Known as chamber lye, it was valued for its ammonia content, which helped lift stains and whiten fabric. The smell? Less helpful. But in a time when perfume was optional and hygiene was interpretive, it did the trick. After soaking, clothes were dragged to the river, scrubbed against wooden boards or large flat stones, and then pounded with paddles, a method known as fulling. It was less gentle wash, and more clothes interrogation. This process could take hours, and often involved the collective effort of washerwomen, who were both feared and admired for their arm strength. Then came the rinsing, and the wringing, and the drying, which, if it rained, meant waiting another day and hoping your shirt didn't develop new sentience. Clothes were often spread across bushes, hedges, or stretched on lines between trees and peasant huts. Medieval villages had the charming aesthetic of a never-ending yard sale. Of course, not everyone did their own laundry. Wealthy households had servants, monasteries had lay brothers, and some towns even had professional washers. But for most people, it was DIY or nothing. Interestingly, clean clothes were more important than clean bodies. You might not have bathed in a month, but if your linen shift was bright and fresh-smelling, relatively speaking, you were considered presentable. In some cases, laundry was your hygiene. After 14 chapters of scratching, scrubbing, sniffing and surviving, the question must finally be asked. Did medieval hygiene actually work? Or was everyone just one unwashed tunic away from spontaneous combustion? The short answer? It worked. Well enough. Not by modern standards, of course. If you were to time travel back to 1347, your nostrils would probably file for divorce. But in their own context, medieval folks weren't completely oblivious to cleanliness. They simply operated on a different scale of what counted as clean. They had systems, even if those systems involved vinegar foot soaks and chamber pots hurled out windows. They had tools: lice combs, linen layers, vinegar, herbs, ash-based soap. They had rituals too. Whether it was sponge bathing before Sunday Mass or boiling one's underwear on a full moon, hygiene existed. It was just deeply interwoven with fear, faith, and the weather. In many ways, medieval people were doing the best they could with what they had, while also constantly trying not to anger God, the local baron, or their own armpits. The idea of regular full-body bathing was risky, time-consuming, and, thanks to church doctrine and plague fears, seen as medically unwise. So they got inventive. And surprisingly, some practices aged well. Linen undergarments were hygienically smart. Herb-infused water and vinegar rinses. Pretty solid antibacterial logic. Even communal bathhouses were effective until they turned into hot tubs of gossip and syphilis. But yes, people smelled. They scratched. They shared baths, lice, and deeply misinformed medical advice. Yet many lived to see old age, or at least a second harvest, despite the hygiene horrors. So while their standards were, let's say, fluid, they weren't without effort. Hygiene was more of a social signal than a science. Clean clothes equaled virtue. Shiny hair, or at least less itchy hair, meant discipline. And avoiding full-body rot was just good manners. In the end, medieval hygiene worked in the same way that balancing a wagon wheel with twine works, barely but impressively considering the tools. Imagine walking through a city over 4,500 years old and realizing it's laid out with more precision than some modern suburbs. Welcome to Mohenjo-Daro, the ancient jewel of the Indus Valley civilization. If you were expecting dusty huts and random alleyways, think again. This place was so well planned, it could make a modern city planner weep with envy. Constructed around 2500 BCE, Mohenjo-Daro wasn't thrown together like a festival campsite. It was meticulously organized. The city was laid out in a grid pattern. Yes, actual blocks and right angles. Streets ran north to south and east to west, intersecting cleanly and forming a neat network of roads. It was as if the architects used a ruler and said, "Let's keep this geometric." But the real magic wasn't just on the surface. Underneath those dusty roads was a system that even 21st century cities often fail to maintain: drainage. Mohenjo-Daro had an underground sewer system. Almost every house, no matter how small, had access to water and drainage. Wastewater flowed from homes into covered drains, running alongside the streets. You could almost hear the ancient residents saying, "Yes, actually, sanitation matters." The city wasn't just a giant bathroom with bricks, though. It was zoned with intention. There was a citadel on a raised mound, probably home to administrative or religious elites, and a lower city where the general population lived. Public buildings like the famed Great Bath suggest that this wasn't just about survival. There was ritual, maybe even recreation, soaked into the clay bricks. Markets likely thrived along the main streets, and houses varied in size, indicating social stratification. But even the modest homes had private wells and toilets. Let that sink in. People with fewer means still had indoor plumbing 4 millennia ago. Meanwhile, many 19th century Europeans were still throwing waste out of windows. And then, mystery. The city was eventually abandoned. No sign of conquest. No dramatic fire. Just silence. Perhaps climate shifts. Perhaps trade disruption. But whatever the cause, the legacy of Mohenjo-Daro endures. A city built with intent, intelligence, and a disturbing awareness that clean water and zoning laws actually matter. And they didn't even have an urban planning department. Go figure. If Mohenjo-Daro was the tidy accountant of ancient cities, Babylon was the theatrical celebrity. Flashy, vast, and drenched in myth, Babylon wasn't just a city. It was a symbol. It rose and fell many times over the centuries. But in its prime, around the 6th century BCE under Nebuchadnezzar II, Babylon was the glittering heart of Mesopotamia. Now, don't let the poetry fool you. This place was as carefully planned as it was majestic. Babylon was a walled city with massive gates, the most famous being the Ishtar Gate, adorned with dazzling blue tiles and sacred lions that looked like they belonged in a dream sequence. And no, it wasn't just decorative. That gate was part of a carefully orchestrated urban layout. At the centre of Babylon's design was a sacred axis, a processional way that ran straight through the city. This wasn't just a road, it was a parade route for gods. Literally. Religious festivals like the Akitu, New Year Festival, would process along this street, linking the great Etemenanke ziggurat, which may or may not have inspired the story of the Tower of Babel, to the mighty Esagila temple, dedicated to the god Marduk. Urban planning here was part piety, part propaganda. You didn't just live in Babylon, you walked its holy narrative every day. Babylon's streets curved with the river and obeyed the land's contours, but they were also zoned smartly. There were residential quarters, temple complexes, gardens, markets, and administrative centres. The Euphrates River sliced through the city, providing not only water but also a navigable artery for trade, commerce, and, let's be honest, showing off. Drainage systems were present, though not quite as refined as in the Indus Valley. Still, homes had bathrooms with clay pipes and canals to move wastewater away. Babylonian engineers were clearly not amateurs. Even bricks bore inscriptions of the king's name, because if you're going to build sewers, you might as well brand them. Babylon was a city designed to impress both mortals and gods. Every street, every gate, every temple was a statement. Look upon my works, ye mighty, and marvel at the zoning permits. And people did. Even Alexander the Great reportedly planned to make Babylon his capital, because once you've walked down a street made for a god, Athens probably felt a bit underwhelming. Roughly 1,000 years before the Aztecs marvelled at its ruins and named it Teotihuacan, the place where gods were born. This ancient Mexican city was already flexing its urban design skills. At its peak around 500 CE, Teotihuacan was one of the largest cities in the world, with a population north of 100,000. And unlike the chaotic sprawl of some modern megacities, this place was deliberately mapped out with the precision of a sacred geometry student who never forgot their protractor. The city's most iconic feature? The Avenue of the Dead. Despite its morbid name, thanks Aztecs, it was less a cemetery and more a ceremonial boulevard stretching over 2 miles. This grand avenue was no accident. It was a central axis, aligned with astronomical events and flanked by temples, plazas, elite residences, and bustling market zones. It connected the Pyramid of the Moon at the north with the enormous Pyramid of the Sun, creating a sacred spine that structured the entire city. Now here's where things get even more advanced. Teotihuacan's layout was orthogonal. The whole city followed a grid system, tilted about 15.5 degrees off true north, possibly to align with specific celestial phenomena or sacred mountains. It wasn't random, it was cosmological. This was urban planning with a cosmic compass. And zoning? Absolutely. Residential compounds were laid out in modular blocks, often housing multiple families with access to shared patios and drainage systems. Some compounds were highly decorated, indicating wealth, while others showed a more communal, working-class lifestyle. This wasn't just a city, it was organised society made visible in stone and stucco. Teotihuacan also had a complex water management system. Canals and drains ran alongside streets and through residential zones, helping to prevent flooding in the rainy season. Engineers clearly understood their environment and planned accordingly. You get the sense they would have been deeply offended by potholes. There's still much we don't know: who ruled, how power was structured. But we do know this: the city was built to impress both the eyes and the skies. Teotihuacan was a blueprint of order, combining ritual with rationality. And when the Aztecs stumbled upon its towering ruins centuries later, they didn't just admire it, they assumed gods must have built it. Honestly, after seeing the symmetry, who could blame them? When we talk about ancient urban planning, It's tempting to imagine a single mastermind, the ancient version of a city architect with a scroll and a vision. But in the Indus Valley civilization, it seems the planning came not from a ruler's decree, but from a cultural consensus so strong that multiple cities across the region, from Harappa to Lothal, share shockingly similar features. These weren't sister cities. They were practically architectural clones. And that says something profound. Take Harappa, located in what is now modern-day Pakistan. Like Mohenjo-Daro, it too was laid out in a grid-like pattern, with uniform brick sizes, clear zoning for industrial, residential, and administrative use, and, you guessed it, advanced drainage systems. Each home was connected to street drains via private chutes or underground terracotta pipes. This wasn't just sanitation. It was dignity by design, ensuring that even common citizens had clean facilities. Lothal, another Indus city near the Arabian Sea, added a new layer of sophistication: port planning. Yes, Lothal had a dockyard, possibly the earliest known in the world, complete with a massive basin and sluice gates to control water levels. This wasn't just a riverside outpost. It was a shipping hub with infrastructure that anticipated tides and flow patterns. And you thought Venice was clever. What makes it even more remarkable is that there's no evidence of kings, palaces, or military fortresses. No statues of ruling elites. No epic inscriptions boasting about victories. Instead, the cities seem to have been run by efficient bureaucracies or councils focused on hygiene, trade, and ritual. Their power came from engineering, not empire. Artifacts like standardized weights and measures suggest a deeply regulated economy, with designated market areas and craft zones. You could almost imagine ancient planning committees arguing over warehouse placement and sewer width, because these decisions were made, and they stuck, across hundreds of miles. And they weren't just building for the elite. The uniformity in home construction, access to water, and public amenities like baths and wells point to an urban ideal that was collective, not hierarchical. The real architects of the Indus cities weren't just building towns. They were shaping a society where order was embedded in every brick, and where planning wasn't a privilege. It was a principle. When we think of zoning today, we picture bureaucrats arguing over parking permits and whether someone's Airbnb violates residential codes. But zoning, dividing a city into designated areas for living, working, worshipping, and dumping your garbage, isn't modern. It's ancient and surprisingly widespread. Cities like Mohenjo-Daro, Babylon, and Teotihuacan weren't just random clusters of buildings. They were carefully orchestrated spaces, each with a logic behind the layout. Let's start with Mohenjo-Daro again. There, the raised citadel housed public baths, granaries, and possibly administrative buildings. Below it lay the residential quarters, with broad avenues separating them. Workshops and kilns were kept at the edges, probably because nobody wanted their home filled with smoke and clanging pottery wheels. It's zoning by common sense. But the impressive part is that this model repeated across Indus cities. Now jump over to Babylon. Babylonian zoning was driven not just by utility, but also by ritual and propaganda. Temples and palaces dominated the city's heart, linked by ceremonial routes. Administrative buildings and elite homes clustered nearby, while commoners and markets were pushed outward. But everyone, rich or poor, lived under the same city layout philosophy: organized, purposeful, and impressively sophisticated. Then there's Teotihuacan. Here, zoning reached almost surgical precision. The city's layout followed a strict grid, but each sector had a clear identity. There were residential compounds, craft production zones, market areas, and temple complexes, all coordinated like parts of a body. Some compounds even housed immigrants, entire neighborhoods of people from Oaxaca or the Gulf Coast, each built in the architectural style of their homeland. It was zoning plus multiculturalism, in 500 CE. This level of spatial organization shows one critical thing. These weren't just cities, they were intentional societies. Urban space reflected values, be they spiritual, political, or economic. Where you lived, where you worked, where you worshipped, these were all pre-mapped by people who understood not only how humans move, but how they relate. And no, they didn't need modern GIS software, just observation, engineering, and maybe a divine mandate or two. Because when a society can enforce zoning laws without Twitter outrage or lawsuits, you know their urban planning game was ahead of its time. We love to imagine the ancient world as gloriously filthy. Muddy streets, chamber pots, and the unmistakable perfume of unwashed crowds. But the truth? Some ancient cities cared a lot about sanitation. In fact, several had public hygiene systems that would make a 19th century European blush. Let's return to Mohenjo-Daro, our sanitation superstar. Nearly every house, regardless of size, had its own private bathing area, complete with a sloped floor to drain water. Wastewater was channeled into covered street drains. Yes, covered drains. Lined with bricks and equipped with access holes for cleaning. The drains ran along nearly every street, carrying waste away from the city. It was basically an early version of municipal plumbing. This was not just clever, it was revolutionary. Compare that to Babylon, where hygiene was more symbolic. The city had canals and some drainage channels, and clay pipes carried water into palaces and temples. But for the average citizen, sanitation involved cesspits, open ditches, and divine forgiveness. Still, bathrooms were common, and wealthier homes had indoor plumbing using clay piping. Some records even describe a rudimentary flushing system, likely involving buckets and good timing. Now let's zoom into Teotihuacan. Though not as obsessed with drainage as the Indus Valley, Teotihuacan still featured carefully engineered stormwater canals and separate sewage systems in elite compounds. Many residential complexes had internal drains, and public buildings often had designated latrines. Cleanliness wasn't just about comfort. It was likely tied to religious purity, especially in ritual areas like temples or the Avenue of the Dead. Even smaller cities in the ancient world, like Lothal and Harappa, reflect a deep understanding of hydrology, with wells, reservoirs, and strategically sloped streets to prevent flooding. Imagine planning an entire town with gravity and seasonal monsoons in mind, and then pulling it off in 2400 BCE. What makes all of this impressive isn't just the tech, it's the mindset. These civilizations viewed water not just as a necessity, but as something to be channeled, shared, and respected. Hygiene wasn't a luxury for the elite, it was embedded in the urban design itself. Modern cities still struggle with waste management. These ancients? They were already digging trenches and laying bricks, quietly reminding us that flushing is a civilizational achievement. If temples were where ancient people spoke to the gods, markets were where they negotiated with each other, and likely argued over the price of onions. Every ancient city we've explored so far had a beating economic heart, and that heart pulsed in the form of carefully planned marketplaces, trade routes, and economic zoning. In Babylon, markets were not a chaotic afterthought squeezed between temples. They were institutionalized, woven into the urban grid, and regulated by law. The Code of Hammurabi, one of the oldest known legal texts, devotes dozens of clauses to trade practices, weights, measures, and merchant behavior. Markets bustled with activity under porticos and open-air squares. Grains, textiles, wine, slaves, and livestock changed hands while scribes tracked debts and transactions. This wasn't just shopping, it was commerce with legal infrastructure. Now shift to Teotihuacan, where things get even more fascinating. The city hosted enormous market plazas, especially near the Ciudadela complex, where thousands gathered to trade obsidian tools, cacao, feathers, ceramics, and salt. Unlike the highly centralized temple economies of some cultures, Teotihuacan's market system appeared decentralized and community-driven, with different neighborhoods specializing in specific crafts. Think of it as an ancient version of local Etsy shops, except your supplier lived in the next compound. Meanwhile, in Mohenjo-Daro and other Indus cities, the urban layout reveals designated bazaar zones with wide avenues and adjacent warehouses. Archaeologists have uncovered standardized weights and scales, suggesting a robust system of regulation. Goods from as far away as Mesopotamia, including seals and precious stones, have been found in Indus sites, indicating that international trade was a thing. Imagine your neighbourhood fishmonger accepting Mesopotamian currency and not even blinking. But it wasn't just about money. Markets were social hubs. In Babylon, they were places to catch gossip, settle disputes, and see who was wearing the latest Assyrian tunic. In Teotihuacan, they were multicultural melting pots, with traders and travellers from distant lands mingling among pyramids. Even the Indus cities, which lacked grand palaces or temples, prioritised economic zones in their design. Trade drove innovation. It demanded roads, regulation, and records. And ancient urban planners responded, not with chaos, but with structure. Behind every sacred temple or fortress wall, there was a merchant yelling, "Best price in the city." In the ancient world, urban planning wasn't just about sewage systems and shopping districts. It was about the gods. Temples weren't hidden in quiet corners. They dominated skylines, sat atop the city's highest points, and demanded prime real estate. If markets were the city's heartbeat, temples were its soul, and ancient planners made sure everyone knew it. Start with Babylon. The skyline was pierced by the Etemenanke ziggurat, a multi-tiered mountain of baked brick dedicated to the god Marduk. It was no modest shrine. It was an architectural flex. Measuring around 91 metres high, if ancient sources are to be believed, it was meant to bridge heaven and earth. And this wasn't just spiritual, it was centralised urban messaging. Roads led to the temple, ceremonies revolved around it, and the entire city bowed, architecturally and ritually, to its divine core. Teotihuacan, too, placed its spiritual heart front and centre. The Pyramid of the Sun and the Pyramid of the Moon weren't just ceremonial structures, they were urban anchors. The Avenue of the Dead connected these temples like a celestial path, aligning with astronomical events and possibly even solstices. Everything, from residential compounds to market spaces, seemed to radiate out from these temples. They weren't background props. They were cosmic coordinates, guiding both foot traffic and philosophy. And then there's Mohenjo-Daro, which didn't have towering ziggurats or pyramids, but instead gave us the Great Bath, a large public water tank likely used for ritual purification. This wasn't just a swimming hole, it was engineered with watertight bricks, a sophisticated drain system, and possibly linked to spiritual practices of cleanliness and rebirth. No idol-lined sanctuaries here, just water, geometry, and silence. In all these cities, sacred spaces were deliberately placed and functionally integrated. The temples weren't isolated, they were connected to processional roads, public courtyards, and administrative centres. Worship wasn't separate from life, it was life. Urban planning reflected this unity. These were not secular societies with temples, they were sacred landscapes disguised as cities. Every brick laid, every street carved, every plaza placed, was part of a larger spiritual choreography. Because in the ancient world, to build a city was to make an offering, and the gods always got the best seat in the house. It's tempting to think of modern cities as products of innovation, blueprints, and civil engineering degrees. But dig a little deeper, literally, and you'll find that the bones of urban life were laid thousands of years ago by planners without concrete, bulldozers, or CAD software. The DNA of city planning, grids, zoning, sanitation, civic centres, religious spaces, was already etched into the earth by people we often underestimate. Take drainage. Mohenjo-Daro didn't just throw down a few ditches. They designed an integrated, multi-level wastewater system that ran through homes and beneath streets. The concept of universal access to sanitation, still elusive in parts of the modern world, was a standard in this Bronze Age metropolis. Babylon laid the groundwork for regulated commerce, civic infrastructure, and the symbolic use of space to reinforce power and religion. Teotihuacan gave us the template of the cosmic city, one where every road, plaza and temple pointed to something bigger than the human eye could see. Its builders connected astronomy to architecture, embedding celestial rhythms into everyday movement. These weren't just settlements, they were philosophical blueprints. And then there's the psychological aspect. Ancient cities influenced behaviour. Wide avenues allowed for processions and parades. Enclosed courtyards created communal spaces. Zoning wasn't just practical, it shaped how people interacted, how neighbourhoods formed, and how authority was visualised. These choices told people where to gather, what was sacred, and how to live in harmony, or at least try. Modern urban planning owes much to this ancient foresight. Grids in Manhattan, sanitation in Amsterdam, temples turned into cathedrals turned into town halls. Even the idea of a civic centre comes from these ancestral cityscapes. We still measure property. We still design cities around access, trade, spirituality, and spectacle. What's changed is the technology, not the principle. And while we pave highways and erect skyscrapers, the core remains. Cities are stories we write in stone, brick, and steel. And the first chapters of that story? They were carved with copper tools, planned with star charts, and sustained by people who believed that good living required good planning. So the next time you walk down a city street, remember, you're not just moving through space. You're walking through 4,000 years of ideas, quietly whispering beneath your feet. Hadrian was not born in the heart of Rome, but on its distant western fringe. He came into the world in 76 CE in Italica, a Romanized town in the province of Hispania Baetica, modern-day southern Spain. Though geographically far from the capital, Hadrian's family was anything but provincial. They were wealthy, elite, and thoroughly Roman in culture and ambition. Most importantly, his father's side was related by blood to Marcus Ulpius Trajanus, the man who would later become Emperor Trajan. Hadrian lost both of his parents at around age 10, a formative tragedy that thrust him into the guardianship of Trajan and Publius Acilius Attianus, a Roman knight. These two men would shape the trajectory of his life. While many young nobles were steered toward military or political careers, Hadrian gravitated toward Greek literature, philosophy, and the arts. He spoke Greek fluently, read Homer obsessively, and preferred a scroll to a sword, at least early on. Rome, of course, didn't run on poetry, so Hadrian, as all ambitious Roman aristocrats did, had to earn his place through service. He began as a military tribune, first in Lower Moesia, then in Upper Moesia, and finally in Pannonia. He proved himself a competent officer, but his deeper talents lay in administration and statecraft. Trajan's rise to the emperorship in 98 CE marked a turning point for Hadrian. Though their relationship was sometimes strained, Hadrian was known for being sharp-tongued, arrogant, and a bit too intellectual for some. Trajan nonetheless kept him close. Hadrian became a quaestor, then tribune of the plebs, and steadily climbed the cursus honorum, Rome's ladder of political advancement. He also married well. His bride was Vibia Sabina, Trajan's grand niece, a politically strategic union, though not a happy one. The marriage was likely loveless and distant, as Hadrian's personal interests leaned more toward philosophical companionship and male intimacy, especially in the case of his later beloved Antinous. Hadrian's early life was defined by this tension between military expectation and artistic temperament. He was a man from the edge of the empire, yet destined to lead it, not through brute force, but through calculated grace. In a world of conquest, he was already dreaming of marble columns and philosophical dialogue. When Emperor Trajan fell gravely ill in 117 CE, the question of succession became urgent and murky. Though Hadrian had long served in the imperial orbit, his claim to the throne wasn't universally accepted. Trajan had never publicly named a successor, and the political elite were divided over whether Hadrian, the aloof intellectual from Hispania, was truly the right man to lead Rome. Trajan died in Selinus, in Asia Minor, far from the capital. Conveniently or suspiciously within days, a letter arrived in Rome stating that Trajan had adopted Hadrian as his son on his deathbed, witnessed by Trajan's wife Plotina and the ever-loyal Attianus. The timing was impeccable. Some senators whispered forgery. Others suspected that Plotina had orchestrated the whole affair, favouring Hadrian's administrative mind over the more militaristic candidates. Regardless of the circumstances, the Senate ratified Hadrian's accession, and he became emperor on August 11th, 117 CE. But the transition was far from smooth. Almost immediately, Hadrian faced crisis. The empire had overextended under Trajan's military campaigns, particularly in Mesopotamia, where rebellion was brewing. Rather than continue aggressive expansion, Hadrian made the pragmatic and unpopular choice to withdraw from Trajan's eastern conquests, including Armenia and Mesopotamia. This angered many senators and military men who had bled for those victories. Hadrian was accused of cowardice, even betrayal. And then came the bloodbath. Shortly after his ascension, 4 prominent senators, who had openly opposed Hadrian's rise, were executed under vague charges of conspiracy. Hadrian publicly denied involvement, blaming Attianus, but few believed him. This act permanently tainted his relationship with the Senate, even as he tried to govern with restraint and lawfulness. The message was clear. Hadrian could philosophize like a Greek, but he would rule like a Roman. Despite political turbulence, Hadrian's first acts as emperor revealed his priorities. He cancelled debts, distributed money to the poor, and secured military loyalty with generous donatives. He made a symbolic break from endless conquest and began refocusing Rome's energy inward, on consolidation, infrastructure, and stability. Hadrian may have come to power through whispered corridors and shadowy signatures, but once in the purple, he wasted no time in making the empire his own. Hadrian wasn't content to rule from the comfort of marble halls in Rome. Unlike most emperors, he saw the empire not as a distant abstraction, but as a living, breathing landscape, and he was determined to walk it. From the moment he secured his throne, Hadrian set out on a mission to visit nearly every province under his control. It wasn't ceremonial, it was hands-on governance, inspection, correction, diplomacy, and vision, all wrapped in sandals and sweat. Over the next 2 decades, Hadrian would log more miles than any emperor before or after him. His first major tour began in 121 CE and lasted nearly 5 years. He travelled through Gaul, Germania, Britannia, Hispania, Africa, the Balkans, Greece, and Asia Minor, not by chariot, but often on foot, alongside his soldiers. It was part leadership, part spectacle. In Britannia, Hadrian witnessed firsthand the instability along Rome's northern frontier. The Caledonian tribes, future Scots, were relentless. Rome had pushed too far, and Hadrian opted to pull back and fortify. The result was his most famous legacy, Hadrian's Wall, a 73-mile-long stone barrier stretching across northern England. It wasn't just military, it was psychological. A statement of limits. Rome would defend what it had, not reach endlessly for more. In Africa, he inspected fortresses and addressed infrastructure. In Asia Minor, he funded public works and temples. In Egypt, he was treated like a living god and nearly drowned on the Nile. Everywhere he went, he tied the empire together through appearances, policy, and architectural patronage. But his favourite stop was always Greece. Hadrian adored Hellenic culture, its language, philosophy, and aesthetics. He participated in the Eleusinian mysteries, patronised philosophers, and even earned the nickname Greculus in his youth. He wasn't insulted. He leaned into it. In Athens, he financed the completion of the Temple of Olympian Zeus, began construction of the Library of Hadrian, and sought to revive the Pan-Hellenic League, uniting Greek cities under cultural pride. His travels weren't vacations, they were statecraft. By physically appearing in every corner of the empire, Hadrian reminded the provinces they were not forgotten. He wasn't just the emperor in Rome, he was the emperor on their roads, in their markets, inspecting their temples, and sharing their dust. Hadrian didn't just walk the empire, he reimagined it in stone. He was a builder by passion, not just policy. His reign marked a golden age of imperial architecture, where concrete and marble became tools of philosophy, power, and cultural fusion. Wherever he went, Hadrian left behind arches, aqueducts, baths, theatres, and temples, not just as monuments, but as blueprints for a unified empire. Perhaps his most iconic contribution within Rome itself was the Pantheon, rebuilt under his orders around 126 CE. While Agrippa's earlier version had burned down, Hadrian's vision transformed it into one of the most enduring buildings in history. With its massive dome and oculus, the Pantheon became a marvel of Roman engineering and a symbol of the heavens touching the earth. It was religious, geometric, cosmic, and deeply Hadrianic. Then there was his villa at Tivoli, a sprawling complex east of Rome that became both retreat and laboratory. Unlike typical imperial villas, Hadrian's estate was a curated architectural portfolio. It replicated famous landmarks from across the empire, Egyptian colonnades, Greek stoas, and even a miniature canal modelled on the Nile. This wasn't a villa, it was a philosopher king's dreamscape, a statement that Rome encompassed all worlds. Across the provinces, he launched massive infrastructure campaigns. In Athens, he completed the temple of Olympian Zeus, a project abandoned for centuries. In North Africa, he funded roads, aqueducts, and granaries. In Asia Minor and the Levant, he rebuilt cities ravaged by earthquakes. In Jerusalem, he controversially refounded the city as Aelia Capitolina, sparking outrage among the Jewish population, an act that would have consequences later. Hadrian's architectural style was as eclectic as his travels. He loved arches, symmetry, and domes, but he also incorporated Greek aesthetics, Egyptian motifs, and local materials. He didn't force Roman identity on the provinces. He wove their traditions into imperial fabric. Architecture for Hadrian wasn't just about utility or beauty. It was a philosophy in stone. A silent way of saying, Rome is not just a place, it is an idea, and this is what it looks like. Through bricks and mortar, Hadrian didn't just preserve the empire, he defined its soul. Among the many people who walked beside Hadrian during his travels, none would leave a deeper emotional imprint than Antinous, a beautiful young man from Bithynia in Asia Minor. Their relationship, tender, controversial, and ultimately tragic, would shape the emperor's personal mythology and produce one of the most unusual cults in Roman history. Antinous first appears in Hadrian's life around 124 CE, likely as a teenage companion. Described in ancient sources as stunningly handsome, quiet, and obedient, Antinous became Hadrian's favourite, accompanying him on journeys throughout the empire, especially in Greece and Egypt. Their relationship, while never officially defined, was widely understood to be romantic. In a society where emperors often wielded absolute power over courtly relationships, Hadrian's bond with Antinous stood out for its intensity and visibility. But in 130 CE, tragedy struck. While sailing along the Nile, Antinous drowned under mysterious circumstances. The details are vague. Some say it was an accident, others whisper of ritual sacrifice, and still others suggest suicide. Whatever the truth, Hadrian was devastated. He openly mourned his companion in ways no Roman emperor ever had before. His grief was public, passionate, and enduring. What followed was one of the most extraordinary acts of imperial memorial in history. Hadrian deified Antinous. He founded a city near the site of his death, Antinopolis, and established cults in his honour throughout the empire. Statues of the young man were commissioned by the hundreds. His image, always idealised and serene, became a new icon of beauty and divine youth. Temples, coins, festivals, and even oracles were devoted to Antinous. In many ways, he became a kind of pagan saint, a god of grief, rebirth, and male beauty. No imperial lover had ever been honoured like this, and for Hadrian, it wasn't political theatre, it was personal mythology, written in stone and marble across continents. The cult of Antinous persisted long after Hadrian's death. His statues outlived empires. His name echoed in the writings of poets and travellers. Through Antinous, Hadrian didn't just immortalise love, he challenged the empire's understanding of what could be divine. Hadrian's reign, though often marked by art, philosophy and travel, was not without fire, and none burned hotter than the Bar Kokhba revolt, the most violent Jewish uprising against Roman rule. It would test the emperor's patience, reveal his ruthless streak, and leave deep scars on the province of Judea. The seeds of rebellion were sown when Hadrian, in an effort to unify the empire under Roman civic religion, attempted to refound Jerusalem as a Roman colony. Aelia Capitolina, named after his own family name and dedicated to Jupiter. To make matters worse, he reportedly planned to build a temple to Jupiter on the ruins of the Second Temple, Judaism's holiest site. Whether this was cultural insensitivity or political provocation, it was seen by the Jewish population as sacrilege. In 132 CE, rebellion erupted under the leadership of Simon Bar Kokhba, a charismatic and militant figure hailed by some as the Messiah. His forces quickly overwhelmed Roman garrisons and retook Jerusalem, establishing a short-lived Jewish state. For 2 years, Bar Kokhba ruled as a de facto prince, minting coins and enforcing Jewish law. Hadrian, initially caught off guard, responded with cold, strategic fury. He summoned his best generals, including Julius Severus, recalled from Britain, and amassed an overwhelming force. What followed was brutal counterinsurgency warfare. Roman troops crushed village after village, deploying scorched earth tactics, siege warfare, and mass executions. No mercy was shown to rebels, or civilians suspected of aiding them. By 135 CE, the revolt was over. Bar Kokhba was dead. The province was devastated. Over 500,000 Jews were killed, according to Roman sources, and countless others were enslaved. Judea was renamed Syria Palestina, a deliberate move to erase Jewish ties to the land. Jewish religious practices were restricted, and the population scattered. Hadrian, once the emperor of architecture and elegance, had shown his iron fist. His rule over Judea remains one of the darkest chapters of his reign, one marked not by roads or domes, but by fire, ashes, and exile. It was a harsh reminder. Hadrian could love books, gods, and boys, but if challenged, he would rule with Roman steel. After years of restless travel, monumental construction, and both diplomacy and brutality, Hadrian began to slow down. The final phase of his life was marked by illness, melancholy, and the deepening sense that even emperors cannot master mortality. The man who had walked the empire in sandals now rarely left his villa, and the philosopher-king grew increasingly reclusive and morbid. By 133 CE, Hadrian was suffering from a chronic illness, likely a form of heart disease or kidney failure, based on ancient descriptions of his bloating, weakness, and difficulty breathing. He grew irritable, depressed, and obsessed with his own death. He began composing poetry about mortality, often bleak and introspective. One of his most famous verses is a whispered farewell to his soul, animula, vagula, blandula, a reflection on the fragility of life and the limits of power. But as his body failed, he still had one final imperial duty, naming a successor. Hadrian had no biological children, and his political instincts were clouded by personal affection. In 136 CE, he adopted Lucius Ceionius Commodus, known as Lucius Aelius Caesar, a relatively obscure senator with a reputation for charm but poor health. Many were puzzled. The man was stylish, possibly soft, and clearly not built to rule. Their doubts were justified. Just months after his adoption, Aelius died suddenly, probably from tuberculosis. Hadrian was devastated and once again scrambling to find a suitable heir. with time running out, he turned to a more traditional choice: Titus Aurelius Antoninus, a respected moderate senator. In 138 CE, Hadrian adopted Antoninus, but with a twist. He demanded that Antoninus in turn adopt Marcus Annius Verus, the young man who would later become Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher-emperor. In this one act, Hadrian effectively engineered the next 2 generations of stable leadership. But it didn't ease his suffering. He retreated to his beloved villa at Tivoli, where he spent his final days surrounded by memories, sculptures, and the ghost of Antinous. His condition worsened, and in the end he attempted suicide multiple times, only to be prevented by his attendants. His death finally came in July 138 CE, at age 62. Hadrian's ashes were placed in the mausoleum he built for himself, a towering cylinder on the Tiber, later known as Castel Sant'Angelo. When Hadrian died in 138 CE, he left behind no empire expanded, but one far more secure, cohesive, and intellectually vibrant than he had found it. His reign was not defined by conquest, like Trajan's, but by consolidation, and that, in hindsight, was a revolutionary act. In an age obsessed with outward glory, Hadrian had the clarity and audacity to look inward. The most visible reminders of his rule still stand. Hadrian's Wall, stretching across northern Britain, became a symbol of imperial strength, not through aggression, but through boundaries. It said, "This is Rome, and that is not." It wasn't just military, it was philosophical. The empire had limits, and knowing them was wise. In the capital, his reconstruction of the Pantheon changed architectural history. Its vast dome remains the largest unreinforced concrete dome in the world. It was a temple not just to the gods, but to the possibility of Roman engineering and imagination. It is the physical embodiment of Hadrian's intellect, precise, timeless, and open to the sky. His villa at Tivoli, with its libraries, water gardens, and recreated temples, became the model for Renaissance palaces centuries later. It was Hadrian's dream of the world, an empire reduced to art and landscape. But Hadrian's legacy wasn't only made of stone. It was also etched in policy and precedent. He reformed Roman law, reorganized the military without constant warfare, and professionalized provincial administration. He visited his provinces not to dazzle them, but to understand them, leaving behind a new model of imperial responsibility. Culturally, his love of Greek philosophy, poetry, and sculpture helped spark a revival of Hellenic traditions across the Roman world. The man once mocked as Graeculus had, in effect, re-Hellenized the empire, not by force, but by taste. And politically, Hadrian's choice of Antoninus Pius and the adoption of Marcus Aurelius ensured an unprecedented period of peace and prosperity, later called the Pax Antonina. His foresight birthed the so-called 5 Good Emperors, a run of stability unmatched in Roman history. Yet he remained a paradox. A builder who destroyed in Judea, a lover of peace with a hidden iron fist, a student of beauty who governed with realism. Hadrian's Rome wasn't just marble and might. It was mind, memory, and measure. Hadrian didn't just rule Rome. He reimagined what it meant to be emperor. His reign stands at the crossroads of military command and philosophical inquiry, of tradition and reinvention. In many ways, Hadrian marked a turning point. The moment the Roman emperor stopped being merely a warlord-in-chief and became a curator of civilization. Unlike his predecessors, Hadrian projected power through presence rather than expansion. By walking the roads, visiting garrisons, inspecting aqueducts, and debating with philosophers, he transformed emperorship into a performance of omnipresent responsibility. The toga and the scroll became as essential as the sword. This shift influenced how future emperors would see their role. His immediate successors, Antoninus Pius and Marcus Aurelius, embraced this vision. They ruled not as conquerors, but as stewards of Roman order, focused on justice, infrastructure, and cultural refinement. Marcus Aurelius, with his Meditations, might never have emerged had Hadrian not elevated philosophy into imperial legitimacy. Hadrian also embodied the paradoxes of power. He was both adored and feared, elegant yet cruel when provoked. His reign was calm by comparison, but beneath it lay authoritarian reflexes. The executions of senators, the crushing of the Bar Kokhba revolt, the exile of dissenters, these revealed a man who preached moderation but wielded authority with surgical ruthlessness when challenged. Privately, Hadrian was introspective and melancholic. His poetry, especially late in life, reveals a man aware of his mortality and contradictions. His love for Antinous, idealized, deified, and mourned, offered an emotional counterweight to his public image. That grief made him human, and it echoes centuries later as a rare moment of imperial vulnerability. Even in death, Hadrian crafted a legacy of enduring presence. His mausoleum, now Rome's Castel Sant'Angelo, stands as a fortress against forgetting. His buildings still define skylines. His laws informed generations. His travels stitched together a multicultural empire into something that, at least briefly, felt united. Hadrian's greatness lies not in what he conquered, but in what he conserved, built, and imagined. He was a paradox with a laurel crown, architect and autocrat, poet and emperor, human and enigma. In the end, Hadrian didn't just leave behind monuments, he left behind a model of emperorship itself, one that still haunts the ruins of Rome and the minds of those who walk them. In 1803, President Thomas Jefferson doubled the size of the United States with the stroke of a pen. The Louisiana Purchase and $15 million deal with France added over 800,000 square miles of mostly uncharted wilderness to the young republic. It was a geopolitical coup, but also a massive cartographic question mark. What exactly had America just bought? Mountains? Deserts? Water routes? Monsters? Jefferson had no clue, but he was determined to find out. Enter Meriwether Lewis, Jefferson's personal secretary, and a man with an insatiable appetite for adventure and scientific notebooks. Jefferson handpicked him to lead an expedition to explore the new territory, map its geography, document its flora and fauna, and most importantly, determine if a water route to the Pacific, the mythical Northwest Passage, actually existed. But Lewis wasn't going alone. He chose his old friend and military comrade, William Clark, as co-leader. While Lewis had a mind for science and diplomacy, Clark brought military discipline, cartographic skill, and an easy rapport with men, a balance Jefferson believed essential. They would be equal leaders, despite the fact that only Lewis held a formal commission. Their unity would become one of the expedition's greatest strengths. Preparations began immediately. Jefferson provided detailed instructions. Observe the landscape, establish trade with native tribes, study plant and animal life, and assert American presence in lands already occupied by dozens of indigenous nations. Subtle diplomacy wrapped in scientific curiosity. Supplies were gathered. Compasses, sextants, microscopes, gifts for native leaders, like beads, mirrors, and peace medals, and even a collapsible iron frame boat, one that never quite worked, but looked great on paper. Dozens of men were recruited, mostly from the US Army. This group would become the Corps of Discovery, a name as ambitious as the journey itself. The expedition launched from Camp du Bois, near St. Louis, in May 1804. Ahead of them lay thousands of miles of unknown terrain, countless tribal nations, and a mission with no guarantee of return. But for Jefferson, Lewis, and Clark, the prize wasn't just land. It was knowledge, the kind that would transform America's future and define its frontier spirit. And so, with maps unwritten and journals blank, the Corps of Discovery set off into the wilderness, chasing a vision only barely glimpsed through Jefferson's dreams. On May 14, 1804, the Corps of Discovery pushed off from the banks of the Missouri River, beginning what would become a 2-year odyssey into lands few Americans had ever seen. Their departure was quiet. No parades, no cheering crowds. Just 33 men in a keelboat and 2 pirogues, hauling nearly 10 tons of supplies upstream into the wild. Their progress was slow. The Missouri River, while their main highway westward, was deceptively treacherous. Shifting sandbars, powerful currents, and dense forests made travel a daily grind. The men used poles, ropes, oars, and sheer will to inch forward against the flow. At times, it must have felt like rowing through wet cement. The crew consisted of hardened frontiersmen, expert hunters, French-Canadian boatmen, and a few soldiers with more grit than polish. Among them were York, Clark's enslaved servant, whose strength and charisma would later earn him deep respect from native tribes, and Charles Floyd, a sergeant whose fate would remind them all how fragile life on the frontier could be. The team quickly fell into a disciplined routine. Clark, ever the cartographer, mapped every bend in the river. Lewis, the naturalist, catalogued flora, fauna, and geological features, collecting samples and describing everything from catfish to mosquitoes with obsessive detail. Every day they encountered new creatures, some majestic like bald eagles and elk, and others less welcome. Gnats, ticks, and biting flies became daily tortures. By late summer, they reached what is now Iowa and South Dakota, where the landscape transformed into sweeping prairies and endless sky. It was here they had their first significant diplomatic meetings with native tribes, including the Otto and Missouri, and later the Teton Sioux. These encounters were tense. Lewis and Clark carried peace medals and flags, symbols of American goodwill, but also power. The message was clear. A new nation had arrived, and it intended to be known. Still, mistrust simmered beneath smiles. The expedition was often outnumbered and outgunned. Diplomacy wasn't optional. It was survival. Missteps could spell disaster. Yet, through brute strength, cooperation, and careful tact, the Corps continued upriver. They hadn't even reached winter yet, but the tone was set. This journey would demand endurance, humility, and nerve. And the Missouri? She was just getting warmed up. By the time autumn 1804 crept across the Great Plains, the Missouri River had begun to slow under the weight of the coming freeze. The Corps of Discovery had travelled over 1,000 miles from St. Louis, and they knew they wouldn't make it to the Rocky Mountains before snow sealed the way west. It was time to pause, regroup, and survive. They chose a spot near present-day Washburn, North Dakota, just downstream from a cluster of Mandan and Hidatsa villages. These native communities had long established permanent earth lodge settlements along the river, agriculturally rich, socially sophisticated, and strategically placed. The Mandan were already seasoned diplomats, having hosted French, British, and Spanish traders. The Americans were just the latest strangers with strange hats. Here, Lewis and Clark ordered the men to build a winter fort, Fort Mandan, named in honour of their hosts. It rose from the frozen prairie like a wooden statement of intent. They were here to stay, at least until spring. Constructed of cottonwood logs, the fort featured high walls, blockhouses, and cramped rooms for over 30 men. It was more drafty than comfortable, but it kept the howling winds at bay. And those winds were merciless. Temperatures often plunged below 0 Fahrenheit. Frostbite was a daily threat. Yet life inside Fort Mandan was far from idle. Lewis and Clark were obsessively recording data, everything from temperature readings to tribal languages, to the exact number of corn kernels in a local cob. Crucially, it was at Fort Mandan that they met Toussaint Charbonneau, a French-Canadian trapper, and his young Shoshone wife, Sacagawea. Though Charbonneau was hired as a translator, it was Sacagawea, pregnant at the time, who would become an indispensable guide in the months ahead. Her knowledge of Western geography and ability to communicate with native tribes would prove more valuable than any musket or map. Relations with the Mandan were mostly peaceful, though tensions occasionally rose. Cultural misunderstandings, resource scarcity, and sheer proximity made friction inevitable. Still, the Corps knew that without native cooperation, their mission could end right there in the snow. By spring 1805, with journals full, gear repaired, and Sacagawea's newborn son, Jean-Baptiste, swaddled and ready, the Corps dismantled Fort Mandan. The next phase of the journey, into the unknown beyond the plains and toward the Rockies, was about to begin. In April 1805, the Corps of Discovery left behind the relative safety of Fort Mandan and re-entered the unpredictable wild. They now travelled lighter, with a smaller party and more urgency. The winter's lull was over. Ahead lay mountains, uncharted rivers, and the question that haunted Jefferson's plan: was there a water route to the Pacific? Spring brought beauty, but also blood-sucking torment. The Missouri River teemed with mosquitoes which harassed the men relentlessly. Sleep was interrupted by swarms. Bison, deer, and bear became more plentiful, yes, but so did blistering sunburn, swollen insect bites, and maddening humidity. Lewis noted it all in his journal, his tone somewhere between scientific curiosity and mild suffering. It was during this stretch that the expedition experienced its first near disaster. While attempting to retrieve a capsized pirogue, Sacagawea calmly rescued critical items, including Clark's journals and maps, earning even deeper respect from the men. She wasn't just a translator, she was a stabilizing force, cool under pressure, adaptable, and fiercely capable. By June, the Corps reached the Great Falls of the Missouri. Not one, but a series of 5 waterfalls stretching across 18 miles. It was a magnificent natural wonder, and an absolute nightmare to portage. The men spent nearly a month hauling boats and supplies overland, around steep cliffs and jagged terrain, using homemade carts and brute strength. Some called it the expedition's most physically grueling challenge. Still, spirits lifted when Lewis spotted the snow-capped Rockies in the distance. That moment, though awe-inspiring, also brought dread. The team had assumed the Rockies would be like the gentle Appalachians. They were not. These were monstrous peaks that would soon dash all hopes of a continuous river route to the Pacific. But hope came in the form of Sacagawea's people, the Shoshone. When the Corps finally made contact, an astonishing reunion unfolded. The chief, Kamiawait, turned out to be Sacagawea's brother. That moment, equal parts luck and legend, shifted everything. The Shoshone agreed to provide horses, supplies, and guides, crucial for the expedition to cross the Bitterroot Mountains, where no boat could go. The Missouri had taken them as far as it could. Now the real climb began. Crossing the Rocky Mountains was never going to be easy, but even the most pessimistic predictions couldn't prepare the Corps of Discovery for the brutal reality of the Bitterroot Range. With the Missouri River behind them and the Pacific still far ahead, the expedition now had to abandon their boats and march on horseback, hauling what they could over narrow, icy trails. Armed with Shoshone horses and guides, the Corps began their trek across the Bitterroot Mountains in early September 1805. The terrain was merciless. Jagged ridges, steep ravines, and thick forest made every step a battle. The trails were often nothing more than game paths, winding through fog, snow, and wind-blasted passes. But the worst enemy? Hunger. Game was nearly non-existent. The men resorted to eating candles, soup made from bear fat, and even horse meat. Journals from this period become haunted by food, reduced to grim catalogues of what was edible and what was simply desperation. Men collapsed from exhaustion, their moccasins disintegrated. Frostbite crept into fingers and toes. One of the most harrowing sections was Lolo Pass, where the party trudged through snowdrifts while gnawing on boiled roots and shredded hides. Clark wrote that they were entirely out of provisions and subsisting on horse meat. It was, quite simply, the lowest physical point of the entire journey, and yet, somehow, they didn't give up. When they emerged from the mountains near present-day Idaho, the Corps stumbled into the lands of the Nez Perce tribe. The Nez Perce could have easily wiped them out, but instead they nursed the starving men back to health, offered fish and camas root, and even helped them construct canoes to continue their journey west by river. It was another miraculous turn of fate, another reminder that indigenous hospitality, not just American grit, made this expedition possible. While resting with the Nez Perce, Lewis and Clark reflected on what lay ahead. They were battered, frostbitten, and malnourished, but now within reach of the Columbia River basin. And that meant one thing: the Pacific was near. But the worst wasn't over. The rivers were wild, the weather unpredictable, and winter was close behind. With the Rocky Mountains behind them and winter closing in, the Corps of Discovery began building dugout canoes from towering ponderosa pines, thanks to Nez Perce assistance. Their next target, the Columbia River, the mighty waterway that would carry them west toward the Pacific Ocean, the end of their long, painful march. But if they thought paddling would be easier than mountain crossing, they were in for a wet, violent surprise. The Columbia was no lazy river. It was fast, rocky, and moody, and at times seemed to fight their very existence. The canoes were heavy and often unstable, especially with the full weight of gear, journals, specimens, and human exhaustion. Treacherous rapids threatened to flip boats and drown precious cargo. More than once, men nearly died. Only quick reflexes and sheer luck kept the expedition from losing everything. Along the way, they encountered several Chinookan and Sahaptin-speaking tribes, whose societies were rich in trade, especially in salmon, a staple food that swam in impossible abundance. The Corps marvelled at the fishing methods, carved plank houses, and detailed canoes. These tribes were savvy, experienced, and wary of newcomers. Diplomacy remained delicate. Some tribes welcomed the strangers, others viewed them as unwanted intruders, inching closer to their world. The farther west they travelled, the more the environment transformed. Rain fell with merciless regularity. The lush forests of what is now Washington and Oregon were beautiful, but cold, damp, and utterly relentless. Clothing moulded. Gunpowder became unreliable. The journals of Lewis and Clark during this period read like diaries from a soggy purgatory. Finally, in mid-November 1805, after 18 months of hardship, the Corps reached the mouth of the Columbia River. And there, through the grey, stormy mist, they caught their first glimpse of the Pacific Ocean. The moment should have been triumphant, but it was anything but romantic. Their camp, hastily constructed near present-day Astoria, Oregon, was a muddy mess of wind and despair. They named the site Fort Clatsop, and they would spend a long, wet winter there. Cold, sick, and plagued by fleas, they spent their days making moccasins, boiling elk meat, and writing page after page of journals. They had made it, but the hardest truth now stared them down. They still had to go back. Reaching the Pacific Ocean in November 1805 should have marked a victory lap for the Corps of Discovery, but the ocean was not in a festive mood. Torrential rain, freezing temperatures, and relentless coastal storms turned their reward into a damp, muddy nightmare. With little choice, the expedition built a crude shelter on the south side of the Columbia River, naming it Fort Clatsop after the local Clatsop tribe. The winter of 1805-1806 was brutal. It rained every single day except for 12, according to Clark's notes. The men's clothing rotted, lice and fleas ran rampant, and scurvy loomed. Elk, their primary food source, had to be hunted daily, often miles from camp. The meat was tough, lean, and barely enough to keep body and morale from collapsing. Despite the discomfort, Lewis and Clark insisted on continued documentation. They detailed tribal customs, geography, weather, plants, and animals, adding hundreds of pages to the scientific record. Lewis meticulously described sea otters, while Clark improved the maps that would later guide generations of settlers. Even in misery, they remained obsessive observers. Interactions with local tribes were mixed. The Clatsop and Chinook peoples were accomplished traders with long-standing networks up and down the coast. They were polite, but not particularly enthusiastic about the Corps' presence. Negotiations over food or supplies often involved stern bargaining, not friendly hospitality. Unlike the Mandan or Nez Perce, these coastal tribes expected reciprocity and didn't mind showing impatience when the Americans offered less than impressive trade goods. And then there was boredom. Trapped in a fort made of soggy logs, waiting for the weather to break, the men passed time making salt, mending clothes and carving wooden souvenirs. Spirits ran low. Illness spread. Even Lewis, usually the steely-eyed scientist, grew irritable and withdrawn. By March 1806, the Corps had had enough. With journals overflowing, samples preserved, and their bodies damp and stiff from months of hardship, they burned candles for the last time at Fort Clatsop, packed what little hadn't rotted, and turned their faces eastward. They had found the Pacific. Now came the real test, surviving the long, punishing return to civilization, without the awe of the unknown, only the memory of every painful step ahead. In March 1806, the Corps of Discovery left Fort Clatsop with soaked clothing, exhausted bodies, and a singular goal: get home. They had accomplished what no other Americans had, reaching the Pacific overland, but the journey back would prove just as perilous, just as draining, and in some ways more complex. The wilderness they had once entered with curiosity now loomed with a different energy, familiar but still unforgiving. They retraced their steps up the Columbia River, struggling once again with high currents, steep cliffs, and tense interactions with native tribes. Supplies ran low. Trade was difficult. The Chinook and other coastal tribes had grown even more cautious, perhaps sensing that the Americans' presence heralded a wave of changes they didn't welcome. By late spring, the Corps made it back across the Bitterroot Mountains, with better weather and smarter preparation this time, though still a grueling test. When they reached the Nez Perce villages, they were welcomed like old friends. The tribe had safely kept their horses, as promised, and helped the Corps prepare for the next leg of the journey. Then, Lewis and Clark made a bold decision. They would split the expedition into smaller groups to explore more territory. Lewis headed north toward the Marias River, hoping to map its connection to the Missouri and extend U.S. territorial claims. Clark followed the Yellowstone River, charting its course and searching for easier routes through the plains. It was a risky move. Communication between groups was impossible, and Lewis's path turned nearly fatal. In late July, Lewis's group encountered Blackfeet warriors, who initially appeared friendly, but grew suspicious when they saw the Americans' firearms and trade goods. One tense night turned deadly. A skirmish broke out, and 2 Blackfeet men were killed, the only violent deaths caused by the expedition. Lewis's party fled under cover of darkness, shaken and wounded. Clark's group had a slightly less dramatic return, though not without its share of injuries and bison stampedes. They built canoes, reunited with Sacagawea and her family, and navigated the Yellowstone with relative success. By August 1806, the 2 groups reunited near the Missouri River. The expedition was whole again, but the mood was somber. The thrill of discovery had passed. Now came the final, grinding paddle home, tired, scarred, but alive. By late August 1806, the Missouri River once again pulled the Corps of Discovery downstream, this time carrying them toward home, not mystery. Their bodies were thinner, their uniforms in tatters, and their journals swollen with mud-stained pages, but they had survived. On September 23, 1806, the expedition finally returned to St. Louis, greeted not with fanfare, but with stunned awe. Many had presumed them dead. In just over 2 years, Lewis and Clark had travelled over 8,000 miles, crossed mountains, navigated roaring rivers, made contact with more than 50 native tribes, and recorded hundreds of new plant and animal species. They had mapped vast portions of the continent with astonishing accuracy and established a firm American presence in lands long claimed by indigenous nations, Britain and Spain. The expedition was hailed as a triumph. Newspapers celebrated their survival and discoveries. President Jefferson, who had watched anxiously for news, was elated. Yet, despite their heroic status, Lewis and Clark's fates diverged sharply after their return. Meriwether Lewis was appointed governor of the Louisiana Territory, but struggled with depression, alcoholism, and debt. Just 3 years after the expedition, in 1809, he died under mysterious circumstances, either by suicide or murder, at a remote inn along the Natchez Trace. His loss cast a shadow over the mission he had once led with such precision and purpose. William Clark, on the other hand, thrived. He became governor of the Missouri Territory, superintendent of Indian Affairs, and remained an influential voice in Western expansion for decades. He named his firstborn son Meriwether Lewis Clark, a tribute to his fallen friend and partner. And what of Sacagawea and York? Sacagawea returned west with her husband and child. Her exact fate is debated, but her symbolic role in American memory only grew. York, Clark's enslaved servant, had become a legend among the native tribes, but despite his contributions, Clark refused to free him for many years, a painful irony that history would not forget. The expedition's legacy is both heroic and complicated. It opened the West to further exploration, trade, and settlement, but also laid the groundwork for the displacement of native peoples whose lands had been mapped without consent. The story of Lewis and Clark is not just one of survival or discovery. It is a story of ambition, resilience, cultural collision, and the high cost of manifest destiny. It reminds us that to explore is human, but to understand what's been changed in the process, that's the real journey.